Classification of Incoterms. Group E, Departure. EXW, X-Works, places the minimum responsibility on the seller with greater responsibility on the buyer. X means from, works means factory, mill, or warehouse. The buyer is responsible for loading the goods on truck or container at the seller's premises and for the subsequent costs and risks. Group F, main carriage unpaid by the seller. FCA, free carrier. The seller delivered the goods, which are cleared for export, to the carrier nominated by the buyer at the named place. The buyer's responsibility for insurance and transportation begins at the same moment. FAC, free alongside ship. The seller is responsible for the costs of transporting and delivering goods alongside a vessel in a port in his country. FAS should be used only for ocean shipments, since risk and responsibility shift from the seller to the buyer when the goods are placed within the reach of the ship's crane. FOB, free on board. The goods are placed on board the shipment by the seller at a port of shipment named in the sales agreement. The risk of loss or damage to the goods is transferred to the buyer when the goods pass the ship's rail. The seller pays the cost of loading the goods. The buyer is responsible for the cargo insurance and other costs and risks. The term FOB is used for ocean freight only, but in practice, many importers and exporters still use the term FOB in the air freight. Group C, main carriage paid by the seller. CFR, cost and freight. CFR requires the seller to pay the costs and freight necessary to bring the goods to the named destination, but the risk of loss or damage to the goods are transferred from the seller to the buyer when the goods pass the ship's rail in the port of shipment. Insurance is the buyer's responsibility. The term CFR is used for ocean freight only, but in practice, the term CFR is still commonly used in the air freight. CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. It is similar to CFR, but instead of the buyer insuring the goods for the maritime period of the voyage, the shipper or seller will insure the merchandise. The seller must pay the costs and freight necessary to bring the goods to the named port of destination, but the risk of loss or damage to the goods and additional costs are transferred from the seller to the buyer. This term can be used only for sea and inland waterway transport. CPT, carriage paid to. The seller must pay the freight for the carriage of the merchandise to the named destination. The risk of loss or damage to the goods and any cost increases are transferred from the seller to the buyer at the point where the goods are taken in charge by a carrier. CIP, Carriage and Insurance Paid To. CIP is similar to CPT, but in addition, the seller pays for the insurance against loss or damage. The buyer undertakes the import customs clearance, payment of customs duties and taxes, and other costs and risks. This term is primarily used for multimodal transport. Group D, Arrival. DAF, Delivered at Frontier. The seller's responsibility is complete when the goods have arrived at the frontier. The buyer is responsible for the cost of the goods to clear customs. This term can be used when the goods are transported by rail and road. DES, Delivered ex-ship. The seller's responsibility is to get the goods to the port of destination or to engage the forwarder to move cargo to the port of destination. DEQ, Delivered ex-key. The buyer is responsible for duties and charges, and the seller is responsible for delivering the goods to port of destination. The buyer must also arrange for customs clearance. The buyer undertakes the cargo insurance and other costs of risks. DDP, Delivered Duty Paid. The shipper or seller is responsible for dealing with all the tasks involved in moving goods from the manufacturing plant to the buyer's door. The shipper or seller's responsibility is to insure the goods and cover all costs and risks, including the payment of duty and fees. The buyer pays the duty and any additional costs which are caused by the failure to clear the goods for import in time. DDP terms tend to be used in intermodal or courier type shipments. DDU, Delivered Duty Unpaid. These arrangements is basically the same as with DDP, except for the fact that the buyer is responsible for the duty, fees, and taxes. The seller has to bear the costs and risks involved in bringing the merchandise in the country of destination. The buyer pays the duty and any additional costs caused by its failure to clear the goods for import in time. This term may be used irrespective of the mode of transport.